Okay, I think we're live. Hi, everyone. We're pleased to have you join us for today's webinar, The Future of Work, in conversation with the CEOs of Ladders and Charter. Thanks for joining us. My name is Chris Brady, Yale College class of 2005. I'm a co-founder of Accelerate Yale and Yale Angels. Accelerate Yale is a global community of diverse alumni and friends of Yale engaged in innovation, tech, and entrepreneurship. Our mission is to cultivate an active, inclusive ecosystem that thoughtfully promotes meaningful connections and collaborations, while also serving as a bridge between alumni and current Yale students. Please note that we are being recorded with all participants muted. Today's session will be 1 hour, and we'll reserve the final 25 minutes for Q&A. If you have a question that you'd like to submit, please do so via the Q&A button on the bottom bar of your screen. And now, without further ado, I have the pleasure of introducing my teammate, Wendy Maldonado D'Amico, Director of Accelerate Yale and Yale Angels.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chris. I'm really excited to introduce tonight's guests, who are thought leaders on the future of work. And I really think that we're in for a treat tonight. As they speak this evening, I encourage everybody who is a participant on tonight's webinar to drop your name and contact info into the chat so we know who's here, and so you can also get to know each other. But we do ask that you put your questions into those Q&A bubbles so that we can keep track of them and they don't get lost in the chat. So first, I would like to introduce Marc Cenedella. Marc is the founder of Ladders, Inc., the home of 100K plus and over careers, and elite resumes, great professional resumes written for free, tips appreciated. It's really cool. He is the author of 7 Amazon Careers #1 bestsellers, including Ladders Resume Guide and Ladders Interviews Guide. He is also the author of American Ambition, one of the largest culture newsletters on Substack. So go find that. A nationally renowned thought leader on careers, career management, and recruiting, Marc is frequently sought out by national media organizations for his expert commentary on employment, resumes, the job search, and the job market. He has been profiled in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Fortune, Wired, and Business Week. He has appeared on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, CNBC, and Bloomberg. He has spoken at Harvard, Yale, Penn, Columbia, and other universities. Previously, Marc was a senior vice president at hotjobs.com, where he served as lead on its sale to Yahoo in 2002 for $436 million.
I've got to edit this bio down.
That's all right. And I'll just leave it there. We know he's Yale, so that's all right. So then, and Marc was also in TD with me. So there's another fun fact. Secondly, Kevin Delaney is CEO and editor-in-chief of Charter, a media and services company that aims to transform every workplace. He was previously a senior editor for the New York Times and The Information. Kevin co-founded Quartz and served as co-CEO and editor-in-chief from 2012 to 2019. Prior to Quartz, Kevin was a reporter at the Wall Street Journal for a decade, with that time split between Paris and San Francisco. He became managing editor of wallstreetjournal.com, where he led efforts that won journalism awards and helped greatly expand the journal's online readership. Early in his career, Kevin was a reporter for Smart Money magazine and a TV producer in Montreal. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a board member at the Internews Global Journalism nonprofit, and is a Yale. So I also, just as a side note, I just know Kevin as Lisbeth's husband, but that's my little side note. Lisbeth was at least his husband, his wife is my classmate. So anyway, without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Kevin and Marc to let us all know what should we be talking about with the future of work. We're so anxious to hear from you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Wendy. I used to have Lisbeth's husband in my bio, but I removed it, but maybe I should put it back. Thanks for having us here. It's great to join this group. Marc, this is a bit of a reunion here, not a Yale reunion, but almost 20 years ago, I was a Wall Street Journal reporter in the San Francisco bureau covering internet companies, including Yahoo, and had the great ambition of turning you into my deep secret source on all things internet. I'm not sure I succeed in that, and I probably was very clumsy about it, but it's been a privilege to know you over these few decades.
Likewise, likewise. I have to hear about the Montreal TV producing someday.
Yeah, there's a story there.
I
I
hope
will
it
tell
involves
you.
poutine.
It involves yeah, it's actually a whole story that that I'll save for another time.
Yeah.
So what Mark and I thought we would do today to kind of mix things up, we know this is not quite yet the Feb Club Yale alumni event, but we have ambitions to keep people awake at this hour and try and share as much as we can in terms of our thinking about this area of the future of work. And so what we've decided to do is break format a little bit and focus on something that we call provocations. And the idea is that Mark and I are each going to take turns reading a statement that we've crafted in advance about what the future of work looks like, and then respond to each other. So we'll take turns with these provocations. And the goal is to kind of push maybe to the limit our convictions to try and say things clear and sort of stimulate some thinking among each other and among you all, and hopefully make this a good use of your evening. So with that, we encourage you to use the chat to respond to things, to object, also the Q&A, and we'll about half of the time, the second half of the time is going to be devoted to us sort of walking through points and questions that you've raised. So with that, Mark, I hope that you might have the honor of leading us off.
Kevin, it's great sharing a stage with you, virtual or otherwise. So I'll start off with the move to remote is permanent. It's real, and it's a structural change in American society. Some folks say as soon as COVID's over, we're going to be moving back to the office. Often that's commercial real estate people who are saying that. But from the data that we're seeing at Ladders and from what I'm seeing in the economy, the move is permanent. We're already at 18% of jobs have moved to be permanently remote as of Q4 of 2021. I think that eventually goes to 33% of jobs are remote, hybrid, or partially remote, with 20% of jobs remaining permanently remote. So I think a third of the US workforce is going to be working permanently remote from here on out.
So Mark, I agree with you, but I want to actually raise a counter argument for you to quickly respond to, which is that we know from all the surveys that all of the workers want to be remote. You know, that if you look, Nick Bloom at Stanford does these regular surveys that are great and show that people want to work 2 to 3 days a week remotely once the pandemic is over, whatever, whatever that means for the survey takers. But there's actually a gap, and their employers actually don't have quite as much conviction around remote work. And so the question I want to put to you is, we've got a lot of CEOs who are ready, on March 1 to get everybody back in the office full time, because that's how you run a company. Maybe defend your contention in the face
exactly what you just said. That's how you run a company. Look, if for the last 40 years, if you graduated 40 years ago and you've been running a company by in-person excellence at knowing how to manage people, knowing how to work the room, knowing how to work in-person meetings. If you're a boomer with 4 years of experience, it's impossible for you to imagine running a company, running your team, leading in any other way than in person. That's where your social skills are. That's where your social dexterity is. So for the boomer bosses, it's very difficult to imagine a world or even hope for a world, or not fear a world where you're no longer in person. Whereas, people coming out of school in the last 5 years are accustomed to this. They've been making friends online since they were 12. And it's a different thing than they expected, but they're able to adapt to it. So I think you're right that the folks at the top of the pyramid are pushing against it. I think ultimately it won't work out though, because the employees will want to be remote, and they'll ultimately look to the extent they want to be remote, they'll look to move to companies where they can work remote.
I'm going to just add to that, and then I'm going to get to my provocation, which is that Slack's Future Forum just released new survey data, 10,000 workers this week, and 72% of workers surveyed said that they would consider leaving their job if they weren't offered the flexibility that they expected from their employer. And I think that is, for me, that's the Trump argument. We're in a moment, not like Donald Trump argument, but that's the like winning argument, for in favor of what your provocation, which is that people are fighting to attract and retain talent. And if people are going to leave, if they force them into the office 5 days a week, they're going to have to concede, basically.
Yeah, and look, you're exactly right. And like you pointed out, most people want to go in 1 or 2 days a week. The challenge on that is most people want to go in 1 or 2 days a week, and they want everybody else to be there on the 1 or 2 days a week that they're in. They're going to get frustrated when they go in and only a third of the company's in on that day. I think that's a real challenge for the concept of hybrid going forward.
I have some thoughts on that, but I want to get to the next provocation. My provocation is that offices are not necessary for most hard knowledge work. We've learned that they're better for the soft work. And just to quickly define, by hard work, I mean, if you're a knowledge worker, it's working your spreadsheet, it's preparing a presentation, it's sending emails to the people you have to send emails to. In the case of someone like me, who's a journalist, it's writing articles and making calls to people who you hope to develop as secret sources. Offices are not great places to do that work. If anything, you're distracted, you have to commute, to spend time commuting. And the data show very clearly that actually people are just as productive outside of the office as they were in the office overall. They're capable of doing work. What offices are really good at is the soft work. And this is the in-person meetings. This is the serendipitous encounters with colleagues. This is the actually just basic trust building and friend making among your colleagues. And so that's the big shift. But probably the more radical part of this is that we've seen that knowledge workers do not be in an office to do their best work.
I'm going to agree with your provocation entirely. Have you ever read Paul Graham's Maker Schedule, Manager Schedule?
No.
So you're familiar with Paul Graham, Y Combinator?
Yeah. Y Combinator.
Famous seed venture capitalist, the person behind Stripe, Airbnb. I can't even list the number. Coinbase. Yeah, I think $400 or $500 billion companies and several $1 billion companies. I'll drop the article into chat. Probably the most influential, least known article in tech. And he talks about Maker Schedule, Manager Schedule, which you're talking about soft versus hard. And he points out like people who are makers who want to do stuff or write stuff or code stuff, they need undisturbed time to be productive. Because if you're in that train of thought, if you're really into the work, and then somebody just drops by and says, "Hey, can I take 5 minutes of your time?" You lose that train of thought, and actually you probably lost 2 hours of productivity. And so he talks about Maker Schedule versus Manager Schedule. It's tremendously liberating for people in tech industry when you share this article with them and explain to them. Makers' eyes kind of pop because they're like, yes, that's exactly what's been happening to me. In the office, I get interrupted and I can't do my best work. So the concepts that you have with soft and hard, or makers versus managers schedule, I think favor what you're saying in that, hey, being remote, being able to have that alone time to be productive is so key to your success when what you do is create, whereas the manager, the soft skills, the leadership skills, relationship building skills, those right now appear to be easier in person. I think the challenge is going to be, and I'd love to hear how, as leader at Charter, I'd love to hear about how you've thought about, hey, we haven't been able to be in person. How have you tried to, build that trust or rapport with people through the medium of Zoom?
Yeah, no, I think it's I'll get to that in a second, but just on your point about Maker Schedule, I just saw, and maybe someone else remembers the name of this company, but there's a new company, and basically what they do is they integrate with your own company's calendar, and they shuffle all of your internal meetings around so that they're all bunched together and that you have maximum what they call, I think, focus time. And so so that you have, all of your meetings in the morning. And it's hard to do that, as you know, kind of on your own. But if you actually have a AI system that's looking across everyone's calendar that you're meeting with, and actually reconfiguring everyone's schedule to allow a more maker schedule, then that is what you get. I think, the truth is that we're just figuring this out in terms of our own company, because we're a small company that was born during the remote times of the pandemic. The places I would look are places like Google and Twitter, which are kind of paradoxically like investing in ginormous amounts of office real estate, which makes zero sense at all. If anything that Mark, you and I just said was true, except that they're reconfiguring these spaces to be soft spaces where people in a kind of hybrid configuration come in and they meet with each other, they get coffee with each other. They're more like they're more like I was going to say like a Yale club or some,
Right.
like, what's the right analogy? Like some
Well, yeah, look, Yale Club, Harvard Club here in Manhattan, those were a response to the move of graduates and kind of the managerial class moving out of Manhattan to the suburbs when the trains came. And you need to have a place to gather. Our institutions and our buildings are going to adapt to the modern world. And I wonder how much it's going to be that the office isn't a place to do work and is more of a place to come in for kind of a coffee clash.
I totally think so. You should not go into your office and put your head down and work on a spreadsheet. You should stay home if you're going to do that. And maybe we could suggest to Wendy a future debate. What's the future of the Yale Club? Because it's an interesting question. Like, what is the Yale Club of the new era that's opening? And maybe it is the Yale Club.
It's the old Yale Club. It's probably a reborn type of Yale Club. All right, should we move along?
Yeah, we'll keep going.
Remote's a huge benefit for the return to workforce mothers, as in-person socialization, the coffee cooler, the good old boys network, the Yuck Yuck Club is eclipsed by better, observable, measurable managerial skills. Returning to the workplace, mothers are actually advantaged by remote work.
All right, I'm with you. I totally agree. And some of the best managers who I've ever met are mothers who or parents, caregivers who've returned from leave. And so I agree with that. I have a counter provocation, which kind of relates, which is that flexible work schedules and hybrid are great for caregivers and workers of color. Implemented poorly, they will also lead to the further domination of white men. And so the Slack Future Forum data out this week actually is really interesting on this point. What they've seen over the last 2 years is that the levels of happiness and engagement of workers of color, and especially women of color, have actually gone up really, statistically very significantly with the shift to remote. And the sort of thinking behind that, the analysis behind that, is that in our current workplaces, there are endless microaggressions and other toxic behaviors that actually make it really hard for people from underrepresented groups to be happy, to be engaged, to do their best work, and to not be dealing with this. So this is a boon. The problem is, if they're implemented poorly, they lead to the further domination of white men. And this is for one simple reason, and that's because of this phenomenon, which is called the proximity bias. And you probably know this proximity bias, I think it's called like distance bias or nearness bias sometimes too. The idea is that if someone is physically closer to you, you actually like them more. And if you see someone more often, you're more likely to have a favorable impression of them. And the problem is that if hybrid work schedules are implemented in ways that it's kind of a free-for-all, you just kind of go in whenever you want. What happens generally is that the white men and the people who have the least caregiving responsibilities are the ones who are in the office. And the result is they see each other more. And when it comes time to give performance evaluations, to give plum assignments, to give raises, they're more likely to, as a result of performance bias, give these to people who they see in the office more. And so Nick Bloom at Stanford and other academics have documented this, and their caution is that this may be subtle, but over a period of years, it actually plays out in some people being left behind if they're not coming to the office as often as others.
Yeah, but I'll push back on that one. So look, so I don't believe hybrid's going to be a real thing. The tech companies that have tried to implement hybrid have kind of failed at it. It's difficult to do. The privileging of the in-person versus the remote, it tends not to work. You either got to go one way or the other. Look, if it turns out that our productivity is higher at home and we can do the work from home, and because of proximity bias, firms, white men, or whoever's dominating them, some firms make suboptimal managerial assignments or pay assignments. The firms that aren't making those suboptimal assignments ought to be able to beat them. So the firm of all people of color who are caregivers who are entirely remote ought to beat the inefficient proximity bias a firm. And that might have been a bit more theoretical 5 or 10 years ago. We just went through, and we're still at the tail end of a 2-year experiment where we said, hey, can we manage the American and the global economy productively? And the American economy, we had a banner year in 2020 and 2021, hugely successful, profitable years, and managers had to learn how to manage objectively rather than this subjective things of subjective nature. That's a real change, right? It's a fundamental change in the last 2 years that I think it's going to be difficult to backslide into good old boys network stuff.
Well, so I have 2 reactions. So one is, I think that's your biggest provocation in a way, which is that hybrid work is not a real thing, because I think that is where a lot of people are going. And
that's where the boomer executives are going.
Well, I mean, that's where effectively as you yourself said, 30% of workplaces are going to be hybrid, 20% solely permanently or solely remote. And so I think that is a big prediction. I'm gonna say 2 other things and then jump to a farther down provocation that relates to this directly. One thing I would say is that I think that you're overestimating the extent to which mediocre or poor managers, which is the majority of American managers statistically, became excellent managers during statistic-driven managers in the course of the pandemic. There are these biases, and I think that I totally agree with you that the theory, we're closer to the theory than we were before. Still feels to me like we're somewhat far away. Can I jump to another provocation? We agree to disagree, and in our Siskel and Ebert way, and then we move on to the thing. I think what you're saying is that it's either remote or fully in office, and not hybrid. And I think one thing that we're going to see is maybe the opposite of what you're saying. And I don't like this. I think it's really disappointing. But I worry that a large percentage of organizations will have failed at hybrid work 2 years from now, and they're not going to go all remote. They're going to shift back to Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 in office cultures. And it's because they didn't do the management work that's required to actually manage hybrid and be deliberate about it in ways that it's successful. And there are 2 cautionary tales that I think are important. One of them is IBM, which actually had a really good remote and hybrid work program for years. The other one is Best Buy, which is actually very similar. They were pioneers in these areas, and both of them abandoned it because the management changed over and they kind of lost their vision on this. And then it was just like a sloppy in-between management style that wasn't good for the company, it wasn't good for the workers. So my provocation back at you, Mark, is that we don't shift to fully remote. It's that we shift to 1990s style Monday through Friday in the office when hybrid work doesn't fully work out.
Yeah, and if you gave me an index of companies that were remote to invest in against the ones that were full time in the office, I'd go long the remote and short the in office. It's a new skill for the 21st century. Same way that the command and control managerial style that came in during the post-war period was a new skill compared to pre-war American managerial economics. There's a new skill that you have to learn. Any experience prior to 2020 just doesn't matter anymore. It was a different world. At the time that Yahoo, for example, said, hey, we're going to stop remote, everybody's got to come in. I mean, the reason they had to stop remote is because there wasn't a culture in the country of, hey, you're going to work remote. And you had a negative selection bias that the people who wanted to work remote were the people who were least likely to be working. That's all changed with 2020. And so going forward, if you are going to limit your workforce to the 50% or the 66% of people who are okay with working 9 to 5 in an office, you're going to fall behind.
Can I ask you another for more investment advice? So we have your ETF that you're launching of
Correct.
Companies that are remote versus companies
Remote, long,
companies.
short, yeah.
What if I offered you a ETF on or commercial, urban commercial real estate? Are you long or short on that? Like over the over
neutral.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So it's going to get converted into apartments. Same way Wall Street has. Pricing won't go up the way it has, but so I think we're not going to see big corporate headquarters in New York City and city centers anymore. The biggest challenge for companies that I'm hearing is that first 10 years out of college, the training years, the 20s. Nobody has figured out how to train remote yet, particularly in things like sales and marketing. So I think there's going to be still a use for companies to have fairly large offices in city centers. But in aggregate, that's going to go away. Big corporate headquarters are going to drift off. I would be long. I'd be long destination and business hotels in nicer climes, because so one of the famous companies globally that does it's all remote from the beginning is GitLab, public company now, been remote from day one, and they have this culture of we're going to meet as a team once a year in a different city, and then sub teams will meet maybe once a quarter in different cities wherever they can. I think there's going to be much more of a let's not spend the money on real estate, let's spend the money on week-long team meetings, offsites effectively.
Elad Gil, who's a Silicon Valley investor, has said that he thinks that there's net flat business travel, because he thinks that people aren't going to be doing this sort of one day in, one day out to make sales calls, but they will be doing these 1 week in and out for offsites and such. Mark, as the time ticks away, I want to get to one or two of the provocations a little bit farther down on our list that might get us into another topic. How about the wage parity? I'm interested in. Can you hit that one?
Highlight it for me. Where am I? There we go. So so right now, Google, Facebook, Twitter are saying. So they said, hey, you can leave San Francisco, go to Boise, fine, and stay there during the pandemic. Now they're saying, if you're going to stay in Boise, you got to get paid Boise wages, which we interpret as being 35% less than San Francisco wages. And a lot of companies are doing that. The problem is they're not isolated in the market, and people have been trying to hire these Google and Facebook employees for years, but they can't unlodge them from their employer. The other employers are willing to pay the full price. They're willing to pay San Francisco. If you are as an engineer, if you as a thought worker are as productive as somebody working in San Francisco or New York, companies that aren't FANG companies, and for folks who haven't heard that term before, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, FANG companies. Companies that aren't FANG companies have been challenged trying to recruit people from FANG companies And so now they'll say, look, if I can get the productivity, I'll pay you the high city wages, even though you're in Boise or Biloxi. You don't have to come to Boston or the Big Apple. So that is going to be a big challenge to Facebook and Google, saying we're going to have these wage differentials. I think in the US, we're going to see ultimately that because of the proximity effect, I think you will see a little bit of a wage premium in big cities, but going from 35% today down to 10%. I think globally, you'll see the wage premium, which is currently talent to talent match. It's as high as 80% between, say, somebody in the United States and India or Nigeria. You'll see that shrink from 80-90% to something more like 20-25% for folks outside of the United States relative to in the US. So it's becoming a national market and a global market for labor, and wage prices are going to respond accordingly.
So Tom Friedman, years later, is finally right. The world is flat, and the engineer in Lagos is going to be paid something approaching the engineer pay in Palo Alto.
We've actually got 3 engineers in Lagos. It's a little bit of a up and coming market now. It's not a lot of folks are there. We're early, and we've got 3 engineers there. And look, there are definitely challenges. Internet connections are tough. A lot of things are tough, but sharp engineers, hungry to be a part of kind of an American tech company, super productive, awesome people. So it's fascinating to see that. It's fascinating to be part of that happening.
I'm gonna stay on pay for a second, and my provocation is that pay transparency is coming for the majority of U.S. jobs. And the reason that I say this is that we're actually seeing a wave of lawmaking that's actually requiring disclosure of salaries when companies post jobs. And so we saw this in Colorado. New York City's city council just passed this, which is probably pretty significant. It goes into effect in May. And in New York, for example, you have to post the minimum and maximum salary for any job that you post in New York. It's a little ambiguous about what it means to post in New York, whether it's someone doing the job there or you actually have a location. So that's all being worked out. What we saw with Colorado is that a lot of companies would post remote jobs and say, this job is open to anyone in the United States unless you're working in Colorado, because they didn't want to have to disclose the salary. I think that New York, and we have some similar laws in Connecticut and in Washington, D.C., I think that what's going to happen is that these laws are going to start forcing companies that have any geographic breadth to start disclosing externally, which also means that they're effectively disclosing internally pay, or at least pay bands for different positions. The reasons for this is good, which is that we know that there's a gap in pay for between men and women, people of color, and that this is actually shedding light on what people are actually paid, forcing employers not to lowball people by asking them to tell them their salary history, that sort of thing. I think it's very positive, but I do think it has big implications. And jump in here.
Utterly worthless. All of these laws around pay transparency, utterly worthless.
Why?
So look, the challenge isn't lack of knowledge, right? Hey, I could make more or whatnot. The challenges are negotiation skills and companies' desire to minimize their payroll. So if you make it that, hey, all positions, you got a post, eventually we end up with, well, a company says they've only got 3 positions, associate, vice president, and CEO, and here's the pay ranges. And then they've got a list of duties that people get, and they pay different rates for different duties. You have to negotiate your duties. So ladders is, we're somewhat famous in the industry for, we get paid by the consumer, not by the employer. So we've always been on the consumer side. We've been trying to get accurate data from recruiters for 20 years. And the games recruiters will play around getting accurate data, around giving you accurate data, are they're legion. So look, if you're hiring a director of sales, if you're somebody who's a little bit on the low side, you want to pay 150, but for somebody who's great, you want to pay 190. You never want to say that, hey, the pay range is 150 to 190, because now every low talent person says they deserve 190. People can't get that out of their head. So the impact it will have is people have to come up with some means of working around the letter of the law to not hurt themselves. So is there a world in which we have pay transparency? There are other societies that have income transparency. I think in Norway, you can actually go down and see what people paid in taxes.
You can look up people's tax returns. Yep.
Yeah, but that's an egalitarian oil wealth society. It's just different. Folks have tried. Let's be open book about pay. Previously, the level of strife that it engenders in a workplace is completely disruptive to work. It won't work. It can't work, regardless of what city councils and state governments say.
I would challenge you on one part of that, which is that there is a large part of the US where pay is fully transparent to you and me, and that is the public sector. So you can look up individual public sector salaries in a lot of places by person. I don't know if they're roiled by that salary transparency, and maybe they're the model.
Right. And you're advocating this as a positive example. We should get the productivity. I was on the phone with an IRS agent today, which was they wanted me to validate my identity, like the nastiest human being in a customer service capacity I've ever met in my life. Emulating the federal government in our pay and employee development practices is probably counterproductive to America's success.
I would say that we need to be really kind to the IRS agents right now, because these people are totally overloaded. They receive 280 million phone calls a year. They're only able to answer like 20 million of them. They're 20% more taxpayers than like 20 years ago or something, and their budget has been cut.
You are an empathetic citizen.
I'm an empathetic citizen. I
love it.
I believe we should fund the IRS so that everyone pays their taxes, that we have excellent customer service. So when Marc Cenedella calls up, there's not some cranky person who's overloaded in their job. And that would be a really amazing future of work.
Right. Look, we've got a very the United States dominates the world. Our social networks dominate the world. Our tech services dominate the world. Mucking with the pay and personnel practices of those companies on a lark, like there really wasn't a lot of research into this New York City Council law, is foolish at best and damaging at worst.
Mark, we're going to agree to disagree, as Jeff Bezos would instruct us, and move on.
All hail Bezos.
Agree and commit. Okay, so we have one more. We're going to commit to doing one more, and I want to hit one of your career related ones. So you have one about documenting your success and schmoozing online, and take your pick.
I'll do the more practical one. So documenting your success is more important than ever. The advice for, I've written a lot of books on resumes. I have a company that writes resumes now, tens of thousands of resumes a month. The advice has always been, look, use numbers in your resume. It's more persuasive versus saying, I helped improve the operation of the company. You say, I decreased customer service wait time at the IRS by 27%. That's more persuasive to a future boss that you can do the job the future boss is looking to hire you for. Now more than ever, when there isn't the schmooze, when there isn't the proximity effect like you were talking about, when there isn't this opportunity to kind of get ahead by being likable quite as much, documenting your success in numbers, dollars, percentage, units is more important than ever. As a professional, for the younger folks in your career, 40, 50 years ahead in your career, learning how to document your success. And this means every quarter writing down the best thing you did that quarter. I'm not saying that this is like take 10 hours a week. Once a quarter, once a season, write down the best thing that you did in numbers and just keep a running list. So when you put together your resume, you have numbers ready to go. And in the remote world where we're hiring for objective performance, that's going to make you stand out.
And so these are the resumes that I see that say, as the VP of marketing, I doubled something and did that.
Yeah.
So basically the way it translates is anywhere you have an opportunity, whether it's on LinkedIn, whether it's your resume, you should actually use as much as possible numbers to back up your achievements. That's your advice, right?
Correct. It's more believable.
Okay. Cool. I'm not going to challenge that one. You're running a resume service, Mark. So I'll challenge you on the IRS as a fellow taxpayer, but on resume format.
Good.
I bow to your expertise.
Good.
Okay, so this I'm gonna kind of stop this amazing conversation, unfortunately, right here, as much as I hate to, because we always leave time for questions from our webinar participants. So I guess, Chris, would you like to pluck some interesting questions from our Q&A boxes? And I would invite everybody who is participating in the webinar to drop some questions in here for Mark and Kevin. They're all yours for the next 20 minutes or so. Chris, you're on mute.
Thanks, Wendy. Mark and Kevin, that was really enjoyable. Thanks. I like that format. I think we might have to borrow that for future webinars. So I'll go to
all the producer and the reporter's idea. He knows how to run media. Great idea,
all
Kevin.
Kevin's idea. Yep.
Well,
all right. Well, kudos, Kevin. We'll give you credit in future webinars when we steal your idea.
How about royalties?
Yeah, we're a nonprofit. If I didn't know if you guys know that, but so I'll just cherry pick this bottom question. To what extent is the ongoing remote work a function of tight labor markets, and what happens when employees don't have this much negotiating power?
Teresa, that's a terrific question. Super insightful. So let's say that's 5 years from now. If we're already, my view is we'll already be structurally remote. It'll be difficult to suddenly spin up, enough office space for 10% of the American workforce to go back into the office. But I think during a downturn, if companies decide that they want to go back into the office, they'd be able to force people. If that happens 5 years from now, I don't think they're going to be able to do it. If it happens 5 weeks from now, Russia invades the Ukraine, crypto drops to $5 instead of $35,000, and we're in kind of another Great Recession environment. I think you're right that could delay the onset of and partially reverse remote.
Mark, are you predicting a bear market in Bitcoin? Just to be clear.
No, if well, I think it's unlikely.
Okay, just clarifying. So I think I generally agree with Mark. There's one nuance, I think, which is that you're going to have some companies that are just culturally, because their executives are so strong-willed, they're going to be all in person. These are, companies like Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, like all Wall Street companies are the ones that have basically called people back in. And I think that one of the factors that is going to determine whether people work for a company or not, like there's a lot of factors that go into like you're deciding who your next employer is. And, there are different things and benefits, compensation, the company's values, the industry. There are lots of things that you might actually factor in. I think one of the factors for some people is going to be flexibility. And I don't think that, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley are going to have a hard time getting the most talented Yale graduates to, work for them out of senior years and enter their training programs because of, because they're elite institutions that pay well and have a certain standing in society. So I think I agree with Mark. I think that as far as we can see out ahead of us, the labor markets are going to be actually pretty tight, and that gives time for things to like kind of gel in place and give remote and hybrid work more of a make it harder to reverse. But I do think that there's going to be a category of companies that just don't really care, and a lot of those, and that you're just going to pick your job based on whether you like that or not.
I'll add one to your list. There is probably an interesting kind of example. In my industry, Indeed.com is no remote, have to be in person. The
Yeah.
10,000 employees in the US, sales team has to be in the office every day.
Yeah.
Kind of a counterexample.
Yeah. I think another category people are going to choose on is politics. Increasingly, as companies become take different stances, like Basecamp and Coinbase and others have said, no societal issue discussion in Slack or things like that. People are going to decide where to work based on that, which I don't think traditionally was the sort of factor that we would have had top of mind in choosing an employer.
So we have a question here. What do you think are some of the most common challenges faced by companies in remote settings? And what do you think of some of the solutions that are out there to address those challenges? You guys want to talk about that?
I think, I think the most common challenge is actually that managers are not well trained in most places, and often it's not their fault. But like, there's been lots of research on this. The average American manager is thrown into managing people as an extra add-on thing to doing the thing that they're actually good at. You might be a good salesperson or a good journalist or whatever you do, and then your reward for doing that is to get this other assignment, which is to manage 5 to 10 other people who do the same thing as you do while still doing the thing that you're doing. And so I think the biggest challenge that of remote, one of the biggest challenges is that managers were like poorly trained to begin with, and now throw in the nuances of asynchronous, flexible communication, burnout, and mental health issues, and everything else that's out there. And you could send people to a few training sessions, but that's probably not adequate to fully equip them to be excellent managers. So I think that that's the biggest thing. The second thing is just making the implicit explicit. So there are lots of things in organizational cultures that you learn by being in proximity to people. So do people show up to meetings on time? Do they dress formally or informally? Do people take long or short lunch breaks? Like, do they leave at 5 p.m. or do they stay later? There are all these things that just are implicit in organizational cultures over time. And when you're a person who's new, who's coming in, and particularly for young people who don't have prior work experience, to actually figure these things out is really challenging. And so there are companies like GitLab is one of them, where they have a 14,000 page internal user manual or company guide where they've tried to actually document all of these implicit things about a culture. That's an extreme case, but I think that it's interesting, and companies need to probably. And then the last thing is something that Marc mentioned is just younger workers who don't have a lot of work experience. How do they get trained if there isn't the ambient training that you have when you're sitting next to someone and you're hearing them do a sales call or interview someone? Companies need to get on top of that.
What about virtual reality? You think that has a future in training?
I think it is. Yeah, I think it's a future in particular kinds of training. So I think it's been shown to be pretty effective, particularly in like physical jobs where you like have to, you put on the VR thing and then you go and you paint the thing or move the thing, like in kind of more blue collar jobs. I think it actually is already pretty valuable. Our company did a virtual reality stand-up meeting recently, and the kind of universal consensus was that it was kind of odd, and people would rather, like, as much as people hate Zoom, they'd rather be on Zoom than be like kind of disembodied, heads kind of bobbing around
in the metaverse,
the Oculus, kind of the weird Oculus space. So I think it's an interesting question, but my own experience doesn't support the idea that people are voluntarily going to want to do their work in virtual reality. in a way that provides the sort of ambient learning that, that we're talking about.
I think the biggest challenge is where does the schmooze glue of an organization happen? That those little conversations, the little niceties that bind you together that used to happen over the water cooler or at the cafe or walking in or walking out or going out for a drink. How does that happen virtually, and where and in what manner? It's a new way of schmoozing. Do you do it during the first 5 minutes of the meeting? Do you have team happy hours? I think the team happy hour thing is the virtual happy hour thing's kind of gone away. That was a first couple months of the pandemic. Nobody really likes it. So we're trying to, I think what I'm seeing is a more personal experience than kind of a real thorough study. Is that schmoozing is kind of where meetings might have been run more structured previously, that schmoozing is kind of coming into we're allotting time in meetings for that schmoozing to happen, because there's no other way to do it. You can't schedule a 5-minute bump in Zoom with each other. Hey, let's go to the water cooler for 5 minutes. So that's probably the toughest thing it's one of the toughest things I think for people to figure out from a day-to-day tactical, how do you do your profession aspect.
I would just add one thing. I think that's totally true. One thing I would say is that we all know these like group bonding on Zoom experiences are just super awkward and cringy, and research shows that people generally like hate them, or enough people hate them that they're not worth doing. But what research has shown is that if you can get a strong, trusting connection between two people on a team, so a one-to-one connection where they're kind of buddied up with each other for some reason, you can actually create equivalent or greater trust among the team if they're individuals who are trusting of each other. And so in a way, like we've been doing it wrong, these like big group kind of awkward bonding things where everyone has a beer and is sitting in their sad desk. Whereas if you buddy up two people and say like, okay, every other week you should connect and just ask each other how they're doing. Or you might pair people who live near each other and say, like, maybe you can go for a walk and just check in on each other. That actually, research shows that actually contributes to the sort of thing that you're talking about, Mark. It's not the same as everyone going to the bar together or hang out in the lunchroom, but it seems to actually help.
Mark, you made me think of a product idea, a virtual water cooler.
Right.
I'll ask a question from Samuel Katara. Forget knowledge workers versus trades or semi-skilled workers for a moment. Within the knowledge workforce, there are still jobs that require in-office work. Think biotech lab research, facilities engineering, construction, project management, etc., which all pay well. Do you imagine a shift in career choices among college or graduate school bound folks towards jobs that have remote flexibility? Seems unlikely, but would it distort the labor markets and have a negative effect?
So you picked some great ones there. What percent in aggregate are those physical presence required jobs? I don't know, but my guess is a ceiling is 25-30% of all kind of professional level, white collar level jobs. And so those won't go remote. We won't be 100% remote. If you need to be manipulating the enzymes in the biotech lab, there's no other substitute for you being there. So I think that that is the core of what's going to stay in office. And while that's the case, I still think we'll see growing to 25-33% remote. How will that impact career choices? I don't think much. Net, I don't think much. Some people prefer that, other people prefer this. It'll sort itself out.
I would just add two quick things. One is that a lot of jobs that people think need to be in the office actually don't. And we saw this at law firms. Probably some people listening work at law firms where the support workers, like in theory, had to be in the office while the partners didn't. But in fact, some of the more progressive law firms have kind of challenged that and found that the support teams can just as easily do their work as home as the partners do. And I think the other best practice is that companies try to find ways to offer some flexibility for workers who actually do need to physically be in the office. And it might be that they go to 4-day work weeks for facilities personnel, or they give them every other Friday off, or they come up with training programs or things like that to try and make it so that there's not a complete dual class system among workers in organizations.
Okay, excellent. Well, you guys, we're going to have to start wrapping up here today. This is a fantastic conversation. Marc and Kevin, it was such an honor for Accelerate Yale to host you this evening. I'm getting lots of texts and emails about how much everybody is enjoying this conversation between the two of you. So before we close things down, I wanted to just make a couple of announcements about what is on deck for everybody to expect in the next couple of months from Accelerate Yale. First of all, our next event will be on February 24th. That will be the VC Investment Outlook for 2022. And we will be hosting a panel of Black VCs for that in honor of Black History Month. So that will be really fun. And that will be that'll be at 4 o'clock in the afternoon because our moderator is based in London. So we'll be during the workday, and hope you guys can join us for that. On March 9th, we will be hosting Anne Miura co-founding partner at Floodgate. And she's also a member of the Yale Corporation. She's the Yale Alumni Fellow. So please join us for Women's History Month. Anne will be our guest for that. If you have suggestions on speakers or topics you would like us to host on these series, please email those to team@accelerateyale.org, or you can contact one of the members of Accelerate Yale. And in closing, I'm going to turn it back over to Chris so that he can wrap us up. Chris, are you going to come back on camera?
Sorry, back, Wendy. We'll also be sending out a member survey in the next week or so that we can learn more about Accelerate Yale community and what kind of topics, speakers, and events interest you. One lucky person will be chosen at random to win an Amazon gift card. Big thank you to everyone for your questions, for your participation in today's webinar. We'd also like to thank YAA Shared Interest Groups for making this event possible. And a recording of today's webinar will be posted on our Accelerate Yale LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube channels. Thanks, everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night. Thanks again,
Chris
Marc
and
and
Wendy.
Kevin. Okay,
Bye,
take
Marc.
care.
Hey, that was
Okay,
excellent,
bye.
Kevin. A lot of fun. Thanks so much for inviting us, Wendy.
Sure, my pleasure. Bye.